So, what are we waiting for? Let's get started on chapter 3 of Peter Pan. Come away, come away. For a moment after Mr. and Mrs. Darling left the house, the night lights by the beds of the three children continued to burn clearly. There was another light in the room now, 1,000 times brighter than night lights, and in the time we have taken to say this, it had been in all the drawers in the nursery, looking for Peter's shadow, rummaged the wardrobe, and turned every pocket inside out. It was not really a light. It made this light by flashing about so quickly, but when it came to rest for a second, you saw it was a fairy, no longer than your hand, but still growing. It was a girl called Tinker Bell, exquisitely gowned in a skeleton leaf. A moment after the fairy's entrance, the window was blown open by the breathing of the little stars, and Peter dropped in. He had carried Tinker Bell part of the way, and his hand was still messy with the fairy dust. Tinker Bell, he called softly, after making sure that the children were asleep. Tink, where are you? She was in a jug for the moment, and liking it extremely. She had never been in a jug before. Oh, do you come out that jug and tell me, do you know where they put my shadow? The loveliest tinkle as of golden bells answered him. It is the fairy language. You ordinary children can never have it. But if you were to hear it, you would know that you had heard of it once before. Tink said that the shadow was in the big box. She meant the chest of drawers, and Peter jumped at the drawers. In a moment, he had recovered his shadow, and in his delight, he forgot that he had shut Tinker Bell up in the drawer. If he thought at all, but I don't believe he ever thought. It was that he and his shadow, when brought near each other, would drawn like drops of water, and when they did not he was appalled. He tried to stick it on with soap from the bathroom, but that also failed. A shudder passed through Peter, and he sat on the floor and cried. His sobs woke Wendy, and she sat up in bed. She was not alarmed to see a stranger crying on the nursery floor. She was only pleasantly interested. Boy, she said courteously, why are you crying? Peter could be exceedingly polite also, having learned that grand manner at fairy ceremonies, and he rose and bowed to her beautifully. She was much pleased, and bowed beautifully to him from the bed. What's your name? He asked. Wendy Moore Angela Darling, she replied with some satisfaction. What is your name? Peter Pan. She was already sure that he must be Peter, but it did seem a comparatively short name. Is that all? Yes, he said rather sharply. He felt for the first time that it was a shortish name. I'm so sorry, said Wendy Moore Angela. It doesn't matter, Peter gulped. She asked where he lived. Second to the right, said Peter, and then straight on till morning. What a funny address. No, it isn't, he said. I mean, Wendy said nicely, remembering that she was a hostess. Is that what they put on the letters? He wished she had not mentioned letters. Don't get any letters, he said contemptuously. But your mother gets letters. Don't have a mother, he said. Not only had he had no mother, but he had not the slightest desire to have one. He thought them very overrated person. Wendy, however, felt at once that she was in the presence of a tragedy. Oh, Peter, no wonder you were crying, she said, and got out of bed and ran to him. I wasn't a crying about mothers, he said rather indignantly. I was crying because I can't get my shadow to stay gone. Besides, I wasn't crying. It has come off? Yes. Then Wendy saw the shadow on the floor, looking so draggled, and she was frightfully sorry for Peter. How awful, she said, but she could not help smiling when she saw that he had been trying to stick it on with soap. How exactly like a boy. Fortunately, she knew at once what to do. It must be sewn on, she said, just a little patronishly. What sewn? He asked. You're dreadfully ignorant. But she was exulting in his ignorance. I shall sew it on for you, my little lamb. I dare say it will hurt a little. Oh, I shan't cry, said Peter, who was already of the opinion that he had never cried in his life. And he clenched his teeth and did not cry. And soon his shadow was behaving properly, though still a little creased. Perhaps I should have ironed it, Wendy said thoughtfully, but Peter, boylike, was indifferent to appearances, and he was now jumping about in the widest glee. Alas, he had already forgotten that he owned his bliss to Wendy. He thought he had attached the shadow himself. How clever I am, he crowed rapturously. Oh, the cleverness of me! It is humiliating to have to confess that this conceited Peter was one of the most fascinating qualities. To put with his brutal frankness, there never was a cockier boy. But for the moment, Wendy was shocked. You concede, she exclaimed with frightful sarcasm. Of course I did nothing. You did a little, Peter said carelessly and continued to dance. A little, she replied with hauteur. If I'm no use, I can at least withdraw. And she sprang in the most dignified way into bed and covered her face with the blankets. To indulge her look up, he pretended to be going away. And when this failed, he sat on the end of the bed and tapped her gently with his foot. Wendy, he said, don't withdraw. I can't help crowing, Wendy, when I am pleased with myself. Wendy, one girl is more use than 20 boys. Do you really think so, Peter? Yes, I do. I think it's perfectly sweet of you, she declared, and I'll get up again. And she sat with him on the side of the bed. She also said she would give him a kiss if he liked, but Peter did not know what she meant, and he held out his hand expectantly. Surely you know what a kiss is, she asked aghast. I shall know when you give it to me. Now, said he, shall I give you a kiss? And she replied with a slight primness, If you please. She made herself rather cheap by inclining her face toward him, but he merely dropped an acorn button into her hand, so she slowly returned her face to where it had been before, and said nicely that she would wear his kiss on the chain around her neck. It was lucky that she did not put it on that chain, for it was afterward to save her life. When people in our set are introduced, it is customary for them to ask each other's age, and so Wendy, who always liked to do the correct thing, asked Peter how old he was. I don't know, he replied uneasily, but I am quite young. He really knew nothing about it, but he had merely suspicion. But he said at a venture, Wendy, I ran away the day I was born. Wendy was quite surprised, but interested, and she indicated in a charming drawing room manner, by a touch on her nightgown, that he could sit nearer her. It was because I heard father and mother, he explained in a low voice, talking about what I was to be when I became a man. He was extraordinarily agitated now. I don't want ever to be a man, he said with passion. I don't always to be a little boy. I want always to be a little boy and to have fun. So I ran away to Kensington Gardens and lived a long, long time among the fairies. She gave him a look of the most intense admiration, and he thought it was because he had run away, but it was really because he knew fairies. You see, Wendy, when the first baby laughed the first time, its laugh broke into 1,000 pieces, and they all went skipping about. And that was the beginning of fairies. And so He went on good naturedly. There ought to be one fairy for every boy and girl. Ought to be, isn't there? No? You see, children know such a lot now. They soon don't believe in fairies, and every time a child says, I don't believe in fairies, there's a fairy somewhere that falls down dead. Really, he thought they had now talked enough about fairies, and it struck him that Tinker Bell was keeping very quiet. I can't think where she has gone to, he said, rising, and called Tink by name. Wendy's heart went flutter with a sudden thrill. Peter, she cried, clutching him. You don't mean to tell me that there is a fairy in this room? She was here just now, he said, a little impatiently. You don't hear her, do you? Asked, and they both listened. The only sound I hear, said Wendy, is like a tinkle of bells. Wendy, he whispered gleefully, I do believe I shut her up in a drawer. He let poor Tink out the drawer, and she flew about the nursery screaming with fury. You shouldn't say such things, Peter retorted. Of course I'm very sorry, but how could I know you were in the drawer? Wendy was not listening to him. Oh, Peter, she cried, if only she would only stand still and let me see her. They hardly ever stand still, he said, but for one moment Wendy saw the romantic figure come to rest on the cuckoo clock. Oh, the lovely, she cried, though Tink's face was still distorted with passion. Tink, said Peter amiably, this lady says she wishes you were her fairy. Tinker Bell answered instantly. What does she say, Peter? He had to translate. She's not very polite. She says you're a great ugly girl, and that she is my fairy. He tried to argue with Tink. You know you can't be my fairy, Tink, because I'm a gentleman and you are a lady. They were together in the armchair by this time, and Wendy pawed him with more questions. If you don't live in Kensington Gardens now, sometime I do still. But where do you live mostly? With the lost boys. Who are they? They're the children who fall out of their perambulators when the nurse is looking the other way. If they're not claimed in 7 days, they are sent far away to the Neverland to defray expenses. I'm captain. What fun it must be! Yes, said cunning Peter, but we are rather lonely. You see, we have no female companionship. And none of the other girls? Oh no, girls, are much too clever to fall off their prams. This flattered Wendy immensely. I think, she said, it is perfectly lovely the way you talk about girls. John, they're just as spicy as us. For a reply, Peter rose and kicked John out of bed, blankets and all, one kick. This seemed to Wendy rather forward for a first meeting, and she told him with spirit that he was not captain in her house. However, John continued to sleep so placidly on the floor that she allowed him to remain there. And I know you meant to be kind, she said, relenting, so you may give me a kiss. For a moment, she had forgotten his ignorance about kisses. What's that? It's like this. She kissed him. Funny, said Peter gravely. If you wish to, said Wendy, keeping her head erect this time. What is it, Wendy? It was exactly as if someone were pulling my hair. That must have been Tink. I never knew her so naughty before. And indeed, Tink was starting about again, using offensive language. But why, Tink? Again Tink replied, You silly ass. Peter could not understand why, but Wendy understood, and she was just slightly disappointed when he admitted that he came to the nursery window not to see her, but to listen to stories. You see, I don't know any stories. None of the Lost Boys know any stories. How perfectly awful, Wendy said. Do you know, Peter asked, why swallows build in the eaves of houses? It is to listen to the stories. Oh, Wendy, your mother was telling you such a lovely story. Which story was it? About the prince who couldn't find the lady who wore the glass slipper. Peter, said Wendy excitedly. That was Cinderella, and he found her, and they lived happily ever after. Peter was so glad that he rose from the floor where they had been sitting and hurried to the window. Where are you going? she cried with misgiving. To tell the boys. Don't go, Peter, she entreated. I know such a lots of story. Those were her precise words, so there can be no denying that it was she who first tempted him. Wendy, do come with me and tell the other boys. Of course, she was very pleased to be asked, but she said, Oh, dear, I can't. Think of Mommy. Besides, I can't fly. I'll teach you. Oh, how lovely to fly. I'll teach you how to jump on the wind's back, and then go away we go. Ooh, she exclaimed rapturously. Wendy, when you are sleeping in your chilly bed, you might be flying without about me, saying funny things to the stars. And there are mermaids. Mermaids with tails? Such long tails. Oh, cried Wendy, to see a mermaid. He had become frightfully cunning. Wendy, he said, how we should all respect you. She was wriggling her body in distress, but he had no pity for her. Wendy, he said, the sly one. You could tuck us in at night. Ooh, none of us has ever been tucked in at night, and her arms went out to him, and you could darn our clothes, and made pockets for us, and none of us had any pockets. How could she resist? Of course, it's awfully fascinating. She cried, Peter, would you teach John and Michael to fly too? If you like, he said indifferently, and she ran to John and Michael and shook them. Wake up, she cried. Peter Pan has come and he is to teach us to fly. Peter rubbed his eyes. Then I shall get up, he said. Of course, he was on the floor already. Hello, he said. I am up. Michael was up by this time also, looking as sharp as a knife with stick blades and a saw. But Peter suddenly signed silence. Their faces assumed the awful craftiness of children, listening for a sound from the grown up world. All was as still as the statue. Then everything was right. No, stop. Everything was wrong. Nana, who had been barking distressfully all the evening, was quiet now. It was her silence they had heard. Out with the light. Hide, quick, cried John, taking command for the only time throughout the whole adventure. And thus, when Lisa entered, holding Nana, the nursery seemed quite its old self, very dark, and you should have sworn you heard its three wicked inmates breathing angelically as they slept. They were really doing it artfully from behind the window curtains. Lisa was in a bad temper, for she was mixing the Christmas pudding in the kitchen, and she had been drawn from them by Nana's absurd suspicion. She thought the best way of getting a little quiet was to take Nana to the nursery for a moment, but in custody, of course. Then you suspicious brute, she said, not sorry that Nana was in disgrace. They are perfectly safe, aren't they? Every one of the little angels sound asleep in bed. Listen to their gentle breathing. Here Michael, encouraged by his success, breathed so loudly that they were nearly detected. Nana knew that kind of breathing, and she tried to drag herself out of Lisa's clutches. But Lisa was dense. No more of it, Nana, she said sternly, pulling her out of the room. I warned you. If bark again, I shall go straight for Master and Mrs. and bring them home from the party, and then oh, won't Master whip you just. She tied the unhappy dog up again. But do you think Nana ceased to bark? Bring Master and Mrs. home from the party. Why, that was just what she wanted. Do you think she cared whether she was whipped for so long as her charges were safe? Unfortunately, Lisa returned to her puddings, and Nana, seeing that no help would come from her, strained at the chain until last she broke it. In another moment, she had burst into the dining room of 27 and flung up her paws to heaven, her most expressive way of making a communication. Mr. and Mrs. Sterling knew at once that something terrible was happening in their nursery, and without a goodbye to their hostess, they rushed into the street. It was now 10 minutes since the three scoundrel has been breathing behind the curtain, and Peter Pan can do a great deal in 10 minutes. It's all right, John announced, emerging from his hiding place. I say, Peter, can you really fly? Instead of troubling to answer them, Peter flew around the room, taking the mantelpiece taking the mantelpiece on the way. How topping, said John and Michael. How sweet, cried Wendy. Yes, I am sweet. Oh, I'm sweet, said Peter, forgetting his manners again. I say, how do you do it? Said John. You just think lovely, wonderful thoughts, Peter explained, and they lift you up in the air. He showed them again. You're so snippy at it. Couldn't you do it very slowly once? Peter did it both slowly and quickly. I've got it now, Wendy, cried John, but soon he found he had not. Not one of them could fly an inch. Of course, Peter had been trifling with them, for no one can fly unless the jerry dust has been blown on him. Unfortunately, as we have mentioned, one of his hands was messy with it, and he blew some on each of them with the most superb results. Now just wiggle on your shoulder this way, he said, and let's go. They were all on their beds, and gallant Michael let go first. He did not quite mean to let go, but he did it, and immediately he was borne across the room. I flew, he screamed while still in midair. John, let go. Oh, lovely. Oh, ripping. Look at me. They were not nearly so elegant as Peter. They could not help kicking a little, but their heads were bobbling against the ceiling, and there is almost nothing so delicious as that. Peter gave Wendy a hand at first, but had to desist. Tank was so indignant. Up and down they went, and round and round. Heavenly was Wendy's word. I say, cried John, why shouldn't we all go out? Of course it was to this that Peter had been luring them. Michael was ready. He wanted to see how long it took him to do 1 billion miles, but Wendy hesitated. Mermaids, said Peter, and they're pirates. Pirates, cried John, seizing his Sunday hat. Let us go at once. It was just at this moment that Mr. and Mrs. Darling hurried with Nana out of 27. They ran into the middle of the street to look up at the nursery window. Yes, it was still shut, but the room was ablaze with light, and most heart-gripping sight of all, they could see a shadow on the curtain, three little figures in night attire circling round and round, not on the floor, but in the air. Not three figures, four. In a tremble, they opened the street door. Mr. Darling would have rushed upstairs, but Mrs. Darling sighed to him to go softly. She even tried to make her heart go softly. Will they reach the nursery in time? If so, how delightful for them! And we shall all breathe a sigh of relief. But there will be no story. On the other hand, if they are not in time, I solemnly promise that it will all come right in the end. They would have reached the nursery in time had it not been that little star were watching them. Once again, the star blew out the window open, and that the smallest star of all called out, Cave, Peter. Then Peter knew that there was not a moment to lose. Come, he cried imperiously, and soared out at once into the night, followed by John and Michael and Wendy. Mr. and Mrs. Darling and Nana rushed into the nursery too late. The birds were flown. What a long chapter. Next chapter will be all about the flight. See ya.